I never expected that a routine shift at the hospital would change the way I saw people forever. As a nurse, I've encountered all kinds of patients, some grateful, some difficult, and some who leave a lasting impression for reasons you'd never anticipate. But this one? He shocked me in a way I still struggle to understand. It started on an ordinary evening. The emergency room was its usual chaos, doctors rushing, monitors beeping, and the quiet hum of conversations filled with worry and relief. That's when I met him, a well-dressed man in his mid-40s, looking far too composed for someone seeking medical help. He wasn't in distress, no visible injuries, yet something about the way he carried himself made me pay attention. His charm was effortless, his smile polite, but there was an edge to him I couldn't quite place. He had come in complaining of chest pain. As I checked his vitals and asked him questions, he was unusually relaxed, almost amused. "You must deal with a lot of stressed out patients," he said with a smirk. I nodded, focusing on my job, but his next words made me pause. "I think I just need a break from my life." There was something deeper in his voice, something unspoken. But before I could ask, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and silenced it immediately. His entire demeanor shifted, just for a second, but I caught it. His wife arrived shortly after, her eyes filled with concern. She was warm, kind, the type of person who radiates sincerity. The way she clutched his hand made it clear how much she cared for him. "He hasn't been himself lately," she admitted to me while he stepped out to take another call. "I just want to make sure he's okay." I reassured her, but deep down I felt something was off. And then, in a moment I will never forget, I found out exactly why. A few minutes later, as I walked past an empty hallway, I saw him, but he wasn't alone. He was standing close to another woman, whispering, holding her hand in a way that no married man should. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about his health. This was about something much bigger, something his wife had no idea about. And what happened next? It left me absolutely speechless. For a moment, I stood frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. The way he leaned in, the way his fingers brushed against hers. It wasn't the casual touch of two acquaintances. It was intimate, familiar. My stomach tightened as I realized exactly what was happening. The woman he was with was younger, maybe in her early 30s. She had an air of confidence about her, like she belonged there, like she had every right to be with him. But she didn't. His wife was still sitting in the waiting room, worried sick about him. And here he was, acting like a man with no commitments, no conscience. I turned away quickly, my heart pounding. This wasn't my business. I was here to do my job, not get involved in someone's personal life. But as I walked back toward the nurse's station, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. I had seen enough of life to know that secrets like this never stayed hidden forever. Minutes later, he returned to his room, his face unreadable. It was like nothing had happened. He smiled at his wife, thanked me for checking on him, and acted like the perfect husband. The shift in his behavior was unsettling. How could someone switch between two lives so effortlessly? I told myself to forget about it, to focus on my work. But just as I was about to leave the room, he caught my eye. For the first time that night, his confident mask slipped, just for a second, and in that brief moment, I saw something unexpected. He wasn't just reckless, he was afraid. I didn't know it then, but what I had witnessed was only the beginning. As I walked out of the room, my mind raced. Why did he look afraid? Was he worried I had seen too much? Or was he afraid of something, or someone, else? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just infidelity. But what? For the next hour, I tried to push it aside, focusing on my patients. But fate had other plans. As I passed by the waiting area, I saw his wife still sitting there, nervously scrolling through her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly, her eyes darting toward the hallway every time a nurse walked by. She wasn't just worried about his health, she was waiting for something. And then, the young woman I had seen with him earlier walked right past her. Neither of them acknowledged each other. No glance, no tension, nothing. It was like they didn't even exist in the same world. That's when it hit me. His wife had no idea. She didn't know who this woman was, didn't know she had just been in the arms of the man she loved. I should have walked away. But then the wife stood up suddenly, clutching her phone with a look of horror on her face, and I knew everything was about to change. Her face went pale as she stared at her phone, her breathing quick and uneven. Something was wrong. I watched as she hesitated, gripping the device like it held something too terrible to process. Then, without a word, she turned and walked briskly toward her husband's room. I followed at a distance, my pulse racing. As she reached the door, she stopped just outside, her fingers trembling as she slowly pushed it open. From where I stood, I could see inside, and what I saw made my heart stop. The young woman was there, standing by his bed, and they weren't just talking. Their hands touched briefly, a silent understanding passing between them. His wife froze, her body stiff with realization. The air in the room shifted, thick with an unspoken truth crashing down all at once. I expected her to burst in, to scream, to demand answers, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped back, her face unreadable, and turned away. Her silence was deafening. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just betrayal. This was something far deeper, something I didn't understand yet. But whatever it was about to reach its breaking point. I expected her to leave, to break down, to do something. But she didn't. She just turned and walked away, her expression eerily calm. That's when I knew something was off. No tears, no anger, just silence. And that silence felt more dangerous than any confrontation. I hesitated for a moment before following her down the hall. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I asked gently, not even sure what I was expecting her to say. She blinked, as if snapping out of a trance, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I just need a moment," she whispered. But there was something in her voice, something cold, something final. She pulled out her phone again, typing quickly, her hands steadier now. Then she made a call. "It's done," she said simply before hanging up. I didn't know who she was talking to or what she meant, but a chill ran down my spine. Minutes later, two men in dark suits entered the hospital, their presence unsettling. They didn't look like family, and they definitely weren't doctors. They walked past me without a glance and headed straight for his room. That's when I realized this wasn't just about betrayal. This was something much, much bigger. And whatever was about to happen, I had a feeling it was going to change everything. I watched as the two men entered his room, their movements calm but purposeful. The air around them felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite explain. The man in the hospital bed looked up, his face draining of color the moment he saw them. He knew exactly who they were. His wife walked in behind them, her expression unreadable. "You lied to me," she said softly, almost too calmly. He opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand. "Don't bother." She turned to the men. "You know what to do." Panic flickered in his eyes. "Wait, please." But they didn't. One of the men leaned in, whispering something in his ear that made his whole body go rigid. His hands clenched the sheets, his breathing uneven. "You don't have to do this," he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. His wife just smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "You made your choice." I felt frozen, unable to move or speak. This wasn't just about an affair. This was about power, control, something much deeper than I had realized. The man wasn't just cheating on his wife, he had betrayed something far bigger, something dangerous. Then, just as suddenly as they arrived, the men stepped back. One of them handed the wife a small envelope. She glanced at it, nodded, and turned to leave. Her husband exhaled sharply, his face still pale, but now filled with something else: relief. No threats, no violence, just a silent message delivered. Whatever had just happened, it was over. Or so I thought. But as she walked past me, she paused, looking me straight in the eye. "You should forget what you saw tonight." And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just a witness. I was part of the secret now, too. I stood there, my heart pounding as she walked away, her heels clicking softly against the hospital floor. The two men followed, their presence lingering like a shadow, even after they disappeared down the hall. The man in the hospital bed let out a shaky breath, running a hand over his face. Whatever had just happened, it had shaken him to his core. I wanted to ask, to understand what I had just witnessed, but something told me it was better not to know. Some secrets were meant to stay buried. He glanced at me then, his eyes hollow, exhausted. "You didn't see anything," he murmured, more to himself than to me. It wasn't a threat, it was a plea. I nodded slowly, though the weight of the moment sat heavy on my chest. I had seen too much, and yet I still didn't fully understand. Who were those men? What had been in that envelope? And most importantly, what had he done to deserve this? But as I walked away, I realized the answers didn't matter. Some stories don't end with clear resolutions. Some just leave you with questions you're too afraid to ask. By the time my shift ended, his wife was gone. He remained in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in thoughts I would never be able to read. The world outside kept moving, as if nothing had happened.